Thanks for listening to In Studio from Simply Timeless. I'm Jay Daniels. One of the greatest joys of hosting this podcast is getting to hear the fascinating stories from so many of our guests. Whenever I first interview someone, I often have them describe their own journey of personal and musical discovery. Take, for instance, the journey of pianist Rossano Sportiello. Born in Italy, he now resides in New York's Greenwich Village. Earlier this year, the talented musician released his latest for Arbors, That's It. Later, he'll share a little bit about that new album, but we begin our conversation in his birthplace of Vigevano, Italy.
So I was born in Vigevano in 1974. I grew up there, went to school, even my musical training was basically all done there in Vigevano in the local music school with the same teacher from the beginning of my classical piano studies until the final graduation. His name was Mr. Carlo Villa. And you see, my family, no one that I know ever played an instrument. So if we go back to my grandparents and my great-grandparents and all uncles and cousins, there is no one that I know that ever played an instrument. So I was the first one really in the family. And I was not pushed to learn music. It was something that I wanted to do. I like to stress this because, normally we hear of children that are pushed by the parents to learn an instrument, especially in those days. We are talking about the early 80s when I started taking music lessons, that there were not video games. So children, they would go to regular school and then they would learn to play an instrument. That was the substitute of the video game. Anyway, so that's what I did. I got into the music school when I was 9 years old. I got accepted there, and I studied classical piano until the age of 22 when I did my final graduation in classical piano. And but already by the age of 14 years old, I was interested very much into jazz and into improvisation. For jazz, my first love was really traditional jazz, whatever you want to call it, New Orleans and Dixieland and swing. When I have to pronounce these names, I feel a little embarrassed because now I see jazz as one thing. To me, it's always an unnecessary limitation to try to give these names, because the greatness of Fats Waller, Bud Powell, Art Tatum, Bill Evans, Tommy Flanagan, Hank Jones, Jelly Roll Morton, the greatness of these great characters of the history of jazz makes them timeless. I don't feel comfortable giving a category to each individual. I see them as different ways to express the same art form. And those personalities were so large, so big that, the category is way too small to contain it. Anyway, that's just my very humble opinion. And so I said I started from learning the repertoire of Dixieland and New Orleans, and I stayed with that for quite a number of years. When I was 18 years old, I got my invitation to join the famous Milano Jazz Gang that for many years was considered to be the number one Italian traditional jazz band and one of the European leading bands in that style, let's say that. And so that was a great opportunity because I learned a lot of the repertoire of Louis Armstrong, the early Louis Armstrong, the Jelly Roll Morton, the King Oliver, and also the tradition of the so-called the revival of the San Francisco style, Lou Waters and Turk Murphy. And this is a minor style that we don't hear people talking much anymore, but there is some great music also in there. So I was blessed, I think, with a good memory, so I would learn all this repertoire very quickly. I would play the tunes, listen to the records, and I had it in my hands. I could play. So in those years, doing this kind of experience really contributed to create a big bulk of repertoire that I still play today after 25 years, I would say. And then later, after the graduation, a few years after the graduation in classical piano, I met two important figures in my development as a jazz musician. The first one is trombonist, cornet player, and arranger, band leader Dan Barrett from California. That he was instrumental to introduce me to Arbors Records and to the late Matt Domber, and that was the beginning of my American chapter. They invited me to play to their festival, Matt and Rachel Domber, and I got the chance to meet many American musicians. We became good friends with Harry Allen. Later on, Harry Allen hired me to play in his quartet right after I moved to New York City in 2007. And you see, one thing leads to another. I never get tired of mentioning that, because that's really how a career is built. You have to do your homework, practice, love the music, and then you meet people, and people will hire you to play, and then you'll meet other musicians, and so on. It goes like that. So then Barrett, and then the second important character was Barry Harris, the great pianist, jazz pianist, and educator that now is 91 years old, still going strong. And then after that, I met Dick Hyman, another fantastic pianist, musician, composer, arranger, that opened up the way to the 92nd Street Y and their series Jazz in July. And so I got lucky that I was getting known in the United States. So by the time I decided to move here, I knew already a lot of people, and as soon as they knew that I was in the US, they started hiring me. And that's how this second chapter of my life got started in the United States. And now I've been here for 13 years. So thanks to all these wonderful musicians that became my friends, and that they got me more and more involved into the American musical family.
And you have made a wonderful impact with the musicians around you. Incidentally, I was able to find your work through a set of trio recordings that you've done with bassist Nicky Parat and drummer Eddie Metz. And I will tell you, there is a certain quality that comes through in your music, and it's evidenced in all of the photos I've noticed of you. You have a very joyful sense about you and your music. In fact, I haven't seen many photos or videos where you aren't smiling at some point. And I was listening to this new album called That's It from Arbors. It just came out a few months ago. And I could hear strains of Art Tatum and strains of Fats Waller within the the harmonics, the voicings, the rhythms. And this is the music that simply makes me happy. I want to talk about the selections for the album itself, but if I can, I'd like to talk about some of the differences between working, say, as a member of an ensemble, whether a trio or quartet. The difference between that and working as a solo artist. As a solo pianist, how might you differently approach the voicings, the rhythm, the tempo, things along those lines in a solo setting?
The first thing that I would like to say is that in a solo setting, the left hand is more prominent, because you see, I in Vigevano, when I was a teenager, that I was trying to make the first experiments in jazz improvisation, there was no one that I know that could play drums or bass or anything. So if I wanted to play jazz, I had to do it just by myself. And so I had to find a way to play and having the music work. So you gotta have your left hand that is providing bass, harmony, and rhythm all together. And this is what the stride piano players did, That way of playing piano really was like the translation on the keyboard of a whole orchestra. That's really what it is. Because these piano players, sometimes they had to play in a big room of people dancing and chatting and shouting. There was no amplification, and maybe the band was just the piano player himself. And I felt a little bit like that. I was a teenager in my parents' living room trying to play the music, and I had to hear the bass. So I started practicing walking bass left hand. And that was a practice that turned out to be very good, because then later on I got involved in so many projects, and I still get involved in projects without the bass, like the Benny Goodman trio with clarinet, drums, and piano. There's no bass. So Benny Goodman had Teddy Wilson, that was a very smooth piano player, but with an incredible left hand. There was really no need for a bass player when you play in that style, with that swing and with that approach. And so that's the first thing that comes to mind. When I play solo piano, the left hand is practically switching from stride piano to walking bass lines. So all of a sudden, it's like the brain is split in two parts. There is the left hand that is the rhythm section, and the right hand is the soloist. And of course, when you have a trio, the left hand will do some stride, but the stride is always like a climax within the improvisation in that particular tune, Even great stride piano player like Ralph Sutton, once he said, I could play stride all night long, but I don't do it, because it gets in the way, and it can get even boring, if you do just the same thing over and over again, So, and when I have a very good bass player, like Nicky and many others that I've been working with, there are some young bass players that I discovered recently here in New York City. These are young gentlemen in their 20s that they are incredible. I would like to mention Felix Mosholm, that is a young gentleman, 23 years old, from Copenhagen, studying at Juilliard. It's an incredible bass player. And then Alexander Cleffy, another incredible bass player. So when I have a bass player like that, I almost feel like I don't want to play left hand. It's very limited and very soft, because the left hand has to blend with the bass and not get in the way. And so that's really the main difference. And then, of course, having the trio, according to the way they play, according to their style, I will adjust also my phrasing. Because sometimes it happens that if you try to play stride with a bass player and a drummer that they never heard about that, then it is not going to work. and vice versa. If you try to play bebop with the bass player and drummer that they never heard a record of Charlie Parker or Bud Powell or piano players like Tommy Flanagan or Hank Jones, that's not going to work. So I think the bass player and the drummer very much influence also the idiom of the language that I try to speak musically.
You are well known for your work as a stride pianist, specifically what they call Harlem Stride. For those who may not be familiar with the term Harlem Stride, what does that involve?
Well, that was the jazz that was played in the 1920s and all the way through the 30s, and even before that, because James P. Johnson, that is considered to be the father of that style, and it's really what stride piano is a further development from ragtime. I say further development because it's richer harmonically. The left hand is more complex, like there is the use of syncopations in the left hand, but also instead of single note bass or octave in the bass, you'll see many times the use of the tenth. And also it became little by little a form of jazz improvisation. Like in the 20s, it started to be established the routine that the musicians, the piano players, they would all of a sudden start improvising on famous popular tunes of the moment. And so probably you've heard of the rent parties where sometimes you would find three piano players challenging each other and having to come up with the fancy tricks and jaw-dropping arrangements of some of these popular tunes. So you could have one night with James P. Johnson, Duke Ellington, and Fats Waller, trying to cut each other, in one of those rent parties. I think it's significant the fact that you see Fats Waller passed away in 1943, and that's also when the bebop started to establish itself as not only a musical idiom but as a cultural movement. And to me, bebop, the bebop that was played in those days was a natural development from stride piano. In fact, and this was Barry Harris that made me notice this before anyone else. He said to me, if you listen to Bud Powell, he plays bebop, but the character of his rhythm is still very much similar to stride piano. And in fact, if you can put on a Bud Powell record, and if you try to play along, like comping in the stride piano style behind Bud Powell, it fits perfectly. So, and this is one more time the proof of the fact that we love to separate music and give names and category, but it's really a whole thing, because at the beginning of the 40s, still everything was happening at the same time, because you still had Fats Waller, you still had James P. Johnson, Willie the Lion, but you had also Thelonious Monk and Bud Powell, Hank Jones. I think that's really the way we need to look at the music. Yeah, and there was, it's called the Harlem Stride piano because that's where the guys were working. You know, that's the center of the musical activity was really Harlem, New York, but also Newark, New Jersey, and Baltimore and Washington, D.C. These places also had fantastic piano players, you know. And other names like Donald Lambert and Cliff Jackson. These were Lucky Roberts. These were amazing virtuosos of the piano, you know. And it's a way of playing the instrument that is very, very challenging, incredibly challenging, and not many people are doing that.
You were mentioning trying to, that some try to assign a certain category or put certain songs or artists into a box. You know, it is defined as this or defined as that. And I was struck by the intersection of so many different influences for your solo recording. You know, there are a number of standards featured on That's It. You know, you start off with the Jerome Kern and Otto Harbach, Smoke Gets in Your Eyes. You move into the work of the Gershwin, Someone to Watch Over Me. And there's even a Rodgers and Hart favorite, Bewitched, Bothered, and Bewildered. And it is placed alongside Bach's Prelude, number 1 in C major, from the first volume of the Well-Tempered Clavier. Do you find that even though some of the influences may not have been strictly jazz, do you find that, yes, your classical influences and some of the other things you might have heard outside of jazz, do you feel that in some way they do come together for this latest recording?
Not for this, only for this, but it's been my goal since my first record as a leader that I did back in 2002. You know, the philosophy to make a new record for me was always to try to play the music that I loved. And on purpose, I always tried to have as many influences shown as possible, almost like a constant necessity of bringing together things, you know. And I realized that by performing live, that within the economy of a performance that you offer to an audience, that sometimes you play a 75 minutes concert or two separate sets of 45 minutes each, or sometimes like in the clubs, you'll have two shows of 1 hour and 15 minutes each, you know. So you gotta have, in my humble opinion, some elements of surprise, because otherwise there is the risk that you can lose the attention of the people, of the audience. Like in the middle of the concert, you throw in a classical music theme, you know, or a pop theme. Why not? Because there is some pop music even today that has got some nice melody and nice chords, you know. And classical music, I mean, if you go look into the Chopin preludes, for example, you know, the themes are so fantastic, and the harmonic solutions that Chopin adopted, and Schumann the same thing, Liszt. And so why not? That can be an endless source of melodic and harmonic references that we can develop into improvisation. And I love doing that. And the audience enjoys very much. They love it, you know. And there is nothing better than when the performer and the audience, they both enjoying what is going on musically, you know. Because I've seen so many times performers playing some music that they were not really enjoying. And the other way also, performers that were very much into something that they enjoyed very much, but didn't come across well to the people. And so the people applaud, they stay there. They're very tolerant, but I'm not sure how much of the message got to them. So I think trying to have a variety of sources and trying to have elements of surprise within the show, it helps to establish and maintain a channel of communication with the audience all the way through. I believe in that very much. And so, again, with this CD, that's it. That's what I try to do. I try to play all the music that pleases me when I play it, and I try to project that feeling. And for the first time, I had the 5 original compositions of mine in one CD. That never happened before. And I'm glad that I did it, because it helped me to gain a little bit of self-assurance that why not? I can also perform my own music and make it fun for myself and hopefully for the audience too.
Do you have a particular process for developing a piece?
Well, I'll tell you a beautiful story. That is the story connected to the tune in the CD that it's entitled Song for Emily. So when the pandemic started in March, I was on tour in Germany, and this was supposed to be a 5 weeks tour. But of course, after less than 2 weeks that I was overseas, everything got canceled because the pandemic was spreading and nobody knew what it was. And so I came back to New York on the first flight available that I found. And I had to be quarantined for 2 weeks. And I did that. And then during those 2 weeks, I kept receiving emails where I saw all my work getting canceled. All my work until the end of the year and beyond, And so I started to be desperate, because even if you have a little bit of savings, New York City is a very tough place to live, Everything is incredibly expensive. So as soon as you stop working, you're going to face some consequences. First, I got depressed, and then second, I said, I got to do something. I cannot just sit around being depressed and complain. So I remember I sent out the newsletter from my website where I was telling people that I was available for virtual lessons, for virtual concerts. And I got the idea also to tell people that I was available to write music on commission. And so I started receiving a few emails from friends and also people that I didn't quite know very well, but maybe I met once or twice on jazz festivals. And this couple, their name is Jane and Reed McKenzie. So Jane wrote to me saying that they received my newsletter and that they had a daughter whose name was Emily that passed away a few years back. And Emily was a very joyous person. And they asked me, why don't you write a song dedicated to our daughter, Emily? And the mother, Jane, said, but don't write anything melancholic or sad. We love Fats Waller, we love Jay McShane, we love Ralph Sutton. Write something, in that direction. And so that I did. I sat at the piano. I was very moved by the fact that this couple was asking me to compose an happy song for their daughter that passed away. and I sat at the piano, and the tune just came out of my hands. I almost didn't have to think about it. Very quickly, I got a piece of manuscript paper, and I wrote down what I had just improvised, basically, and the tune was there. And I have to tell you that that tune right now, since I composed it, Song for Emily, is one of my favorite tunes to perform. That never happened to me before. Then the other tune that is called She's There is dedicated to my wife, and it happened the same thing. I sat at the piano, and I start, as they say, noodling, and all of a sudden I realized I had a tune ready. So again, reach for some manuscript paper and write it down as quick as possible to retain the ideas, and the tune was there. So I experienced that many times in music. The best music that you can conceive sometimes is the music that just travels through yourself. Because I found myself sometimes in the other situation where you, without a special reason, want to sit down and write a tune, and you stay hours there and nothing comes out. And then you have occasions like the ones that I just mentioned, that it's enough to sit at the piano and start playing something, and right away it's a tune. You know, I read somewhere that Michel Legrand used to compose like that. He would place a tape recorder on top of the piano, turn it on recording mode, and then he would start improvising. And then he would listen back and realize that many of the ideas that he just improvised actually were tunes. You know, I find this very, very fascinating, very much.
As we think about the album as a whole, and as we offer a few closing thoughts, how do you feel that this latest album, That's It, how do you feel it best represents this current point in your career?
After I did the recording, and so I had to prepare, you see, Rachel Domber at Arbors Records, she was fantastic because she told me, you know, you record what you want, you use the photos that you want, you write in the booklet what you want. So she gave me really complete freedom to do what I felt like doing. After I did the recording, I realized that really 2020 marked the 30 years of performing jazz, working as a professional jazz piano player, because I started getting the first professional calls with freelance bands in Milan, in the area of Milan, when I was 16 years old. That was 1990. And so I said, you know, in this booklet of the CD, where, by the way, Dick Hyman wrote the liner notes, and he was very generous. And then also other two legends, Terry Gibbs and Barry Harris. They were extremely kind and generous with their comments that I could publish on the CD, in the booklet. And so I decided that 2020, I was not going to mention that about the pandemic, because I said, you know what, 2020 is not going to be, for me, a cursed year. It's going to be a celebration year. And I tried to convince myself about that. And it turned out to be like this, because, you know, I think 2020 was the year that in my life I had the biggest production, outpouring of music, because I did the new CD. I published between the spring and the summer more than 200 videos on Facebook. of interpretations of standards. And I just did that to try to shine some light out there. And then after that, I did 20 some live streamed performance. I started another series of, I would say, more educational, also on Facebook. So it's an incredible amount of music that got thrown out there thanks to the social medias also. So indeed, 2020 became the year of celebration of 30 years of activity as a jazz musician. And I think that if you have the time, if the listener have the time to sit down for 70 minutes, that's how long is the CD, and listen through, I think that's the main feeling that you get from this music. That's music that wants to celebrate.
One final thought. Why music?
Because to me, and I think I can interpret also the feeling of many other people, so many of our emotions and memories in our lives, they are so much connected to music, to songs, simple songs, popular songs, to jazz, to classical, things that happened in our lives that we remember with great pleasure and nostalgia. And these emotions, these memories are so much associated to some music that we heard in that one occasion. And also the fact that in my case, music was what drives me to tears. It's what excites me. Music is the way that I think I can better communicate my thoughts and my emotions. I cannot do that with the spoken language. That's not my... But I can sit at the piano and tell you exactly what I think by playing that instrument. It's my mean of communication, my favorite one. So that's why music. And I remember on one of the last concerts that I did in the United States, before the pandemic hit, that this was a tour in Florida that we have been doing every year now for about 10 years, I guess, with Eddie Metz and Nicky Perrott. On this one concert, I started playing out of the blue in the middle of the concert, Misty, and that's a wonderful tune. Man, Misty is a masterpiece, Some musicians, they don't want to play it anymore because they think that it's too commercial. I don't care about it. If something is commercial, there is nothing wrong with it. But the tune in itself is a masterpiece. And so I started playing the tune, and I see the drummer, Ed Metz, that he has got a little tear coming down. After the concert, he told me that as soon as I played the first 3 notes of that song, dee-da-da, he saw right in the first row a couple that they might have been way in their 80s. As soon as they heard those 3 notes, they reached for each other's hand. And I get emotional right now by talking about this. And this explains why music. That's it.
A very fitting end to our conversation with Rossano Sportiello. The name of the album, That's It, and it's available now from Arbors Records. More information at his website, rossanosportiello.com. Thanks to Rossano for making the time to speak with us, and a special thanks to you, our listener. Until we meet again, I'm Jay Daniels. This is In Studio from Simply Timeless.